right. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm going to ask you to go ahead and turn your Bible to the book of Esther. Book of Esther. We're going to begin our study there this evening. As I told you from the beginning of class, the three books that were assigned to me this quarter were Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And when I looked at those, even though they're all in the same time period, I felt like the themes of Ezra and Nehemiah were a little bit different than the theme of Esther. So we talked about the original restoration and the work to restore the temple, restore the walls, restore the people of God out of exile. And now we're kind of backtracking a little bit because the book of Nehemiah ends way after the events that happen in the book of Esther. But we're going to backtrack a little bit, and we're going to talk about Esther and the themes that we find in this book. So appreciate you guys being here to study. Ryan's going to lead us in a prayer, and then we'll get going. Amen. So I have up here on the screen a question that may or may not make you uncomfortable. It is, tell me about a time in your life when you suspected that God was helping you through providence. Now, I didn't put that question up there because I wanted to start a discussion, because I feel like that could really easily get off the rails, and I don't want to lose control of my class. But I put it up there because I want you to think about the way that you see God usually working in your life. That's what the word providence, it means God's providence. It means the way that He provides through His power and His will in our lives. And usually when we think about God's providence, when we think about His providence, we think about that in terms of what He does for us personally. And I think if we investigate that question, we think about it on the surface level, that's usually how we think about it. When was a time God worked His providence on my life? Well, when He helped me get a new job, or He helped me get a raise at my old job, or He made sure I got the house that I wanted, or He made sure that I had the number of kids that I wanted, or whatever. We think about the good things that God did for us personally. We think about personal ambition. We think about personal comfort. We think about personal achievement. I want you to understand that when it comes to providence, we ought to be careful. Because God's providence, as we learn in the book of Esther, is often a whole lot more about His purposes and His glory than it is about our achievements, our comfort, or our ambition. And so I want you to think about providence that way. Not, God is working to help me have a good life, but God is working to accomplish His purposes for His people in this world. I also want you to understand that one of my mentors in preaching, he always used to like to say this, that providence cannot be viewed prospectively. Nobody looks at their life and says, oh, 2 weeks from now, God is going to work through His providence to accomplish this for me. You can't view it ahead of you. Providence can only be viewed retrospectively, and then only with suspicion. And that is often how it works. We feel like God has done something, or God has moved, or God has provided, but at the end of the day, it's always kind of hard to put our finger on it. And I think that's important for setting the tone for what we're going to talk about in this class, because we're going to be talking about how God provides, especially how He provides in the palace of King Ahasuerus and in the life of Queen Esther. One of the things that does become clear throughout all the restoration stories is that the hand of God is always providing. We see this, we see Him orchestrating everything that happens throughout Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. At the beginning of the book of Ezra, we see God is the one who stirs the heart of King Cyrus, gets him to sign the proclamation to let the people go home. When Ezra returns to the land of promise, he credits the good hand of God for making it possible for him to go there. When Ezra gathers the necessary Levites for him to go home and teach the people, he credits God's good hand again. In Nehemiah 1, Nehemiah again credits God's hand for allowing the exiles to go home. In Nehemiah chapter 2, we see again Nehemiah is granted passage back home by God's good hand. In Nehemiah 2 again, he stirs up the people and gets them to work by reminding them about God's good hand. When they finish the wall in Nehemiah 6, they credit the good hand of God and his providence. In Nehemiah 9, when Nehemiah offers his prayer of confession, and he talks about all the things that they've done wrong through history, he also talks about how God's hand was always providing for them and allowing them to come back and prospering them when they did return. He credits God's good hand. And throughout all of these books, we see Nehemiah constantly asking God to remember him and provide for him. So one thing, if anything, ties all three of these books together, it is that God moves for his people. God is active among his people. And that's evident in the story of Esther as well. Esther is the only book in the Bible that does not mention God by name. And yet, he is still very visible in the story. We see God's hand is working. God's hand is protecting his people. Now, before we dive into the book of Esther, I do want to do a little background on what's happening here, just to remind you where this book falls and what's happening. To get a sense of what's happening, I want you to remember all the way back at the beginning of Ezra, Ezra 1, when Cyrus issues his decree, this is what it says. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you, of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. Every survivor, at whatever place he may live, let the men of that place support him with silver and gold, with goods and cattle, together with a freewill offering for the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. So remember that all of this restoration starts with a decree that calls for every survivor to go home. And while we made the point early on in our very first class that it's hard to be 100% certain that staying behind in Persia is sinful, it is something that we shouldn't feel great about, because the proclamation comes from God, who stirs the heart of Cyrus, and Cyrus says very clearly which survivors are supposed to go home. Where is it? Every survivor, right? They're all supposed to go home. And there's a danger. There's a danger to staying behind in Persia. That's a bad idea, because by staying in Persia, these people who are the people of God, they are disconnected from God's mission and God's purpose. God's purpose with this group of people was that they would gather together and that through them the Messiah would come into the world. What happens when you say, no, I'm not going to go home and help rebuild this nation, I'm going to stay in Persia? You are not connected to the mission God has for you, and that's a problem. And there's also the trouble, the fear, that by staying behind in Persia, you're going to kind of get absorbed by Persian society. You know, it's hard enough for these people to remain distinct when they're back home in Jerusalem and they are their own nation. Imagine how hard it is for them not to intermarry, for them to remain distinct when they stay there in that pagan culture in Persia. And so it's troubling to think that many of these survivors decided to stay in Persia and not go home. If we fast forward to Ezra chapter 6, then we see those exiles, the first group, they finished the work God intended for them to do. They were told to rebuild the temple, and that's what they do. In Ezra 7, we see Ezra go back, and he's going to go teach the people all the things that they need to know about the law of God. And we said that in between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7, there's a 57-year gap, and I believe that's exactly where the story of Esther is. So understand that Esther and her family are a part of that group of people who decided, we're not going to go home. We're not going to be a part of God's mission. We're going to take the risk. We're going to stay here in the midst of Persian society. And that's who they are. They decided to stay behind. I'll also point this out as well. It's not as if Esther and her cousin Mordecai were the ones who decided to stay. After all, we're talking about a 57-year period here. By the time we get to the story of Esther, Esther is a young lady, probably, not very old at all, maybe in her teens, maybe in her 20s at the most, right? And Mordecai, he's not her uncle like we sometimes say he is. What is he? Cousin, right? He's the cousin. I always, in the Bible class, I don't know if somebody misspoke, but in my mind I'm always thinking uncle, uncle. No, not uncle, cousin. Which means that he's probably older than her because he's raising her, but they're probably not, he's probably not 82 years old, okay? He's probably not that much older than her, which means they're probably not the ones who made the decision to stay home in Persia. It was probably their parents, the people who came before them, that decided to stay home. And now, their story, they have to face what they're going to face because of the decisions that their parents made by deciding to stay in Persia. And they experience trouble in Persia. They're forced to live lives of secrecy and danger. They have to hide their ethnicity. They have to live side by side with genocidal freaks like Haman, like we see in the story. They're constantly worried about being found out. And this is the life that they have to live because they chose to stay. And I say that to make one final point about restoration before we move on and get into the book of Esther. Sometimes we don't engage in spiritual restoration because we're scared of what might happen. But really, we should be far more afraid of what might happen to us by remaining stagnant. Stagnation, spiritually, is far more scary than restoration. And we don't think about it that way. Sometimes when it comes to us personally, we neglect restoration because we think, well, changing myself and that's going to be hard. That's going to be a difficult process. But we don't understand that it is much harder to live a life of spiritual stagnation than it is to engage in spiritual restoration. Sometimes when it comes to my family, we don't engage in restoration. We don't try to turn our families around and say, hey, we're going to do better about spiritual things. We're going to change some things. We don't want to lay down the law with maybe our husband or our wife or our kids because we're scared of what might happen. But we don't understand that that's not the scariest thing. What's far more scary than trying to lay down the law in your family and be more spiritual and restore your family is by letting your family stagnate spiritually and drift off into sinful corruption. A church may be scared of restoration. They may be afraid to speak the truth bluntly and plainly. They may be afraid, hey, if we deal with some of these hard topics that we haven't dealt with in a while, we might lose people. People might walk away. We might offend people. They might leave this church. And we don't realize that what's far more scary than that is the idea that a church would remain stagnant and that those topics would continue to not be addressed and that people would continue to not have the knowledge they need and the church as a whole would drift away from the truth rather than losing a few people. We tell ourselves often that restoration is scary, but stagnation is far more scary than that. And that's what we see when we compare the story of Ezra and Zerubbabel and Nehemiah with what Esther and Mordecai have to experience in their life. All right, any thoughts or questions about that? Hopefully not, because we're running out of time. All right, so I want to get into the story of Esther. Now, I want to approach this book a little bit of a different way than we've done the last two. I want to start this evening by simply reading through the whole book. I want to do that because sometimes in Bible study, when you say, okay, we're going to take a chapter at a time, we're going to take 10 verses at a time, and then talk about the applications, and then move on to the next one, then talk about the applications, and move on to the next one, sometimes we miss the forest for the trees. We get so stuck on these little personal things that are happening that are really important to talk about that we miss the gist of the whole story. And I think when it comes to the book of Esther, it's really, really important for us to get a sense for the story as a whole. It is an amazing story that's worth telling in its entirety. Now, we're going to read through this. I'm expecting it'll take us about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, maybe. But I think that's going to serve a good purpose for us throughout the rest of this class and the next two classes for us to have the conversation we need to have. Roland, you have a question?
I've read this, not everybody, many times.
You got it. It's coming. Actually, I got Ethan to do that. That's why he's in this class. There you go. I don't know. Not. There you go. Well, that's interesting. That's interesting. She's not the worst character in this book. As we go through this story, as we read through it, what I want you to do, and what we're going to do for the rest of this class and the next two classes, is we're going to focus in on the characters in this story. Primarily, we're going to focus on King Ahasuerus. We're going to focus on Mordecai, Haman, and Esther. And so as we read through, I want you to focus on these characters. If you have a pen, if you have some notes, I want you, as we read through, to make notes about what you see in them, what stands out to you about who they are. And most importantly, as we read through, I want you to note how you see God using them throughout the story. Because that's the cool thing. That's why I want to look at it this way. Because God uses every single character in their own unique way. Not for their own personal ambition or achievement or comfort, but for His glory and His purposes. So notice those things. Take note of these characters, talk about what you see in them, and note how you see God using them. That being said, this is the story of Esther. Now it took place in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which was at the citadel in Susa. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his princes and attendants, the army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of his provinces being in his presence. And he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. When these days were completed, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days for all the people who were present at the citadel in Susa, from the greatest to the least in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were hangings of fine white and violet linen, held by cords of fine purple linen on silver rings and marble columns, and couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels of various kinds, and the royal wine was plentiful according to the king's bounty. The drinking was done according to the law. There was no compulsion, for so the king had given orders to each official of his household that he should do according to the desires of each person. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass. Thank you very much. The 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the princes, for she was beautiful. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. Then the king became very angry, and his wrath burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for it was the custom of the king so to speak before all who knew law and justice, and were close to him, Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media who had access to the king's presence and sat in the first place in the kingdom. According to the law, what is to be done with Queen Vashti? Because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs. In the presence of the king and the princes, Memucan said, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also all of the princes and all the peoples who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands by saying, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in his presence, but she did not come. This day the ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's conduct will speak in the same way to all the king's princes, and there will be plenty of contempt and anger. If it pleases the king, let a royal edict be issued by him, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, so that it cannot be repealed, that Vashti may no longer come into the presence of King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is more worthy than she. When the king's edict, which he will make is heard throughout all the kingdom, great as it is, then all the women will give honor to their husbands, great and small. This word pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. So he sent the letters to all the king's provinces, to each province according to his script, and to every people according to their language, that every man should be master in his own house, and the one who speaks in the language of his own people. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti, and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's attendants who served him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Let the king appoint overseers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather every beautiful young virgin to the citadel in Susa, to the harem, into the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given to them. Then let the young lady who pleases the king be queen in place of Vashti." And the matter pleased the king, and he did accordingly. Now there was in the citadel, in Susa, a Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Pause right there. That's important, and you'll understand why when we get to chapter 3. Notice that this guy, Mordecai, he comes from the line of Saul. Saul was also the son of Kish. Saul was also a Benjamite. That's going to become important in a minute. Who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with captives, who had been exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. Now the young lady was beautiful, of form and face, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it came about, when the command and the decree of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered together to the citadel of Susa into the custody of Haggai, that Esther was taken into the king's palace, into the custody of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. Now the young lady pleased him and found favor with him. So he quickly provided her with cosmetics and food, gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace, and transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. Every day Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. Now when the turn of each young lady came to go in to King Ahasuerus, at the end of her 12 months, under the regulations for the women, for the days of their beautification were completed as follows: 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and the cosmetics for women. The young lady would go into the king in this way. Anything that she desired was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not again go into the king unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, came to go into the king, she did not request anything except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, advised. And Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus, to his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his princes and his servants. He also made a holiday for the provinces and gave gifts according to the king's bounty. When the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, even as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther did what Mordecai told her, as she had done when under his care. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the king's officials from those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. But the plot became known to Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. Now when the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of Chronicles in the king's presence. After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. Pause. That's why Mordecai's ancestry is important. Mordecai is from the tribe of Benjamin. He's the son of Kish, which means he's related to his ancestor Saul. In the Old Testament, Saul was commanded to do what? He was commanded to kill all of the Amalekites, and their king's name was King Agag. And his big mistake was allowing many of the best livestock to escape and to let the king live. Here we have Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. And so you see the conflict beginning in this book right here. Mordecai is a Jew from the line of Saul, And Haman is related to all of those Amalekites that the Jews were supposed to exterminate. Verse 2, all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why are you transgressing the king's command? Now it was when they had spoken daily to him that he would not listen to them. And they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. In the first month, which is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, that is the lot, was cast before Haman from day to day and from month to month, until the 12th month, that is the month Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of all the other people, and they do not observe the king's laws. So it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. If it's pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business to put into the king's treasuries. Then the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said to Haman, the silver is yours, and the people also, to do with them as you please. Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and it was written, just as Haman commanded to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, and to the princes of each people, each province according to its script, each people according to its language, being written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed up with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to seize their possessions as plunder. A copy of the edict to be issued as law in every province was published to all the peoples, so that they should be ready for this day. The couriers went out, impelled by the king's command, while the decree was issued at the citadel in Susa. And while the king and Haman sat down to drink, the city of Susa was in confusion. Pause right there. What a statement that is, by the way. He has just signed a document almost on a whim to let this guy exterminate an entire race of people, and while everybody in the city is freaking out, he and Haman sit on the back porch drinking. It really is a testament to just his indifference, his coldness, and just the gruesome nature of this king and this nation. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and wailed loudly and bitterly. He went as far as the king's gate, for no one was to enter the king's gates clothed in sackcloth. In each and every province where the command and decree of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay on sackcloth and ashes. Then Esther's maidens and her eunuchs came and told her, and the queen writhed in great anguish. And she sent garments to clothe Mordecai, that he might remove his sackcloth from him, but he did not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach from the king's eunuchs, whom the king had appointed to attend to her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. So Hathach went out to Mordecai to the city square in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict, which had been issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show Esther and inform her, and to order her to go to the king to implore his favor and plead with him for her people. Hathach came back and related Mordecai's words to Esther. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and ordered him to reply to Mordecai, all the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king, to the inner court, who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death, unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. They related Esther's words to Mordecai. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this?" Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way, and thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had commanded him. Now it came about on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's rooms, and the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. When the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight, and the king extended to Esther the golden scepter which was in his hand. So Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king said to her, "What is troubling you, Queen Esther? And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom it shall be given to you." Esther said, "If it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared for him." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, that we may do as Esther desires." So the king and Haman came to the banquet which Esther had prepared. As they drank their wine at the banquet, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? For it shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom it shall be done." So Esther replied, "My petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and do what I request, may the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king says." Then Haman went out that day glad and pleased of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand up or tremble before him, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. Haman controlled himself, however, went to his house, and sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman recounted to them the glory of his riches, and the number of his sons, and every instance where the king had magnified him, and how he had promoted him above the princes and servants of the king. Haman sounds great at a party. Haman also said, "Even Esther the queen, let no one but me come with the king to the banquet which she had prepared, and tomorrow also I am invited by her with the king. Yet all of this does not satisfy me every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Then Zeresh his wife and all his friends said to him, "Have a gallows 50 cubits high made, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully with the king to the banquet." And the advice pleased Haman. So he had the gallows made. If you pause right there, you noticed everything in this story so far looks like it's trending bad. Everything is bad so far. Haman gets what he wants. He makes this plan that he's going to exterminate all the Jews. The king's okay with it. He sends out all the couriers so that everybody in every province is ready to exterminate the Jews. Haman is mad, and he makes this gallows at the advice of his wife, and he has, at the end of chapter 5, he's made his plan. Tomorrow, understand, there's no large time gap here. Tomorrow, he's going to go ask for Mordecai to be hanged on this gallows, and he's expecting the king to say yes. Everything in the book of Esther turns by one simple thing that happens when you get to chapter 6. One very innocuous thing. During that night, the king could not sleep. So he gave an order to bring the book of records, the Chronicles, as they were read before the king. It was found written that Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers, that they had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. The king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." So the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows which he had prepared for him. The king's servant said to him, "Behold, Haman is standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Who would the king desire to honor more than me?" Then Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king desires to honor, let him bring a royal robe which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes, and let them array the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, 'Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor.'" Then the king said to Haman, take quickly the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not fall short in anything of all that you have said. So Haman took the robe and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried home mourning, with his head covered. Haman recounted to Zeresh his wife and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and Zeresh his wife said to him, if Mordecai before whom you have begun to fall is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. And the king said to Esther on the second day also, as they drank their wine at the banquet, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom it shall be done. Then Queen Esther replied, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given as my petition, and my people as my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not be commensurate with the annoyance to the king. Then King Ahasuerus asked Esther, who is he, and where is he who would presume to do this? Esther said, a foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. The king arose in his anger from drinking wine, and went into the palace garden, but Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king. Now when the king returned from the palace garden into the place where they were drinking wine, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, will he even assault the queen with me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs who were before the king, said, behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house is 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king. And the king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows, which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. I'm going to pause there, because that took a little bit longer than I expected it to. And I do want to spend a moment talking about King Ahasuerus. I hate pausing there, because it's kind of undoing my whole point, because what we've done so far is we've gotten Mordecai and Esther okay, but it's such a bigger story than that. We'll read 8, 9, and 10 later. But I want you to think about King Ahasuerus and what we learn about him. When I think about him, there is one word that describes the king, and that is excessive. All throughout this story, you see excess in King Ahasuerus. Here we go. I'm going to skip a couple of there. What do we learn from him? One word to describe Ahasuerus, and that word is Ahasuerus is a man of excess. Notice how over and over in this book, you want to read back through these chapters at some point this week, notice how it plays out. He is a man who is excessive when it comes to wine. At the beginning of the story with the feast, the wine is abundant. They're told you can drink as much as you want. In chapter 3, after he signs the decree, he's drinking again. Then when he goes to the banquet with Esther, what's he doing? He's drinking again. He is a man who is excessive when it comes to wine. He's also excessive when it comes to food. They feast for how many days at the beginning of the book? 187, I guess. 180 days is how long their feast is. That's pretty excessive. He's also a man who's excessively concerned with riches. Notice what convinces him to agree to exterminate all the Jews. What does Haman promise? 10,000 talents of silver. He is a man who is excessively concerned with wealth. He is a man who is excessively concerned with women. When they decide how they're going to find the next queen, they gather up, probably not voluntarily, but under compulsion, as many young, beautiful women as they can find, and they let him have as many nights as he wants with all of them. That is pretty disgusting and excessive. He's also a man of excess when it comes to his anger. The text mentions multiple times how the king's anger rises and how the king's anger subsides. And everybody seems to be aware of just how much his anger can get out of control. He is a man of excess. He drinks excessively. He eats excessively. He pursues fleshly lust excessively. He has excessive wealth, and he cares about it excessively. He is a man of rage with an excessive temper. And for that reason, I want you to appreciate this, that the man who is the most powerful man in the world is a pitiful shell of a man. Somebody who is so excessive is somebody who is ultimately weak. That's what Ahasuerus is. He is a man of weakness. And I want you to appreciate that not only is he manipulated by his appetites and his desires, everybody around him knows about this, and they know how to manipulate him too. At the beginning of the book, he's mad because his wife won't listen to him, and she's out of control. And all he wants, more than anything else, is to control what's going on around him. But what you see through the whole story is he's controlled by his appetites, and the people around him use his appetites to control him. Doesn't Haman do that? Haman knows how much he loves money, so he wants to kill all the Jews. What's he do? I'm going to offer you a bunch of money, so you'll let me kill the Jews. Esther knows how much he loves to drink, so when she decides she's going to make a request, what does she do? She puts wine in front of him. She's pretty smart in the way she does that. Esther also knows what kind of temper she has. She knows that if she can get him angry at Haman, that Haman ain't going to survive the day. Ahasuerus is a man who is excessive, and thus he is a man who is out of control, and thus he is a man who is weak. Everybody around him uses his appetites to control him instead of being controlled. It is no wonder that the Bible tells us, the Spirit tells us, that Christians are supposed to be people who are self-controlled and temperate, because it is only then that we can truly live the way God wants us to live. He uses our temperance to make us good instruments for him, vessels to accomplish his glory here in this world. But I want you to understand that it's not just the people around Ahasuerus that use his appetites to control him. God uses him too. God providentially uses this man Ahasuerus to accomplish his purposes. Understand, this is very important. It's important we don't lose the plot of the story, because sometimes we look at the story of Esther and we think it's a princess story. It's like Disney, right? The princess is there, something bad happens to her, then the king swoops in, saves the day, she lives happily ever after. This story isn't about Esther living happily ever after, which is why it's a shame we never talk about chapters 8 and 9 and 10, because that's really where the meat of this story is. God uses Esther not to give her a great life, but to save his people. So read this verse with me, Esther 8. In verse 8, after all of this happens and Mordecai dies, and the Disney movie is already rolling to the credits, there's still more story. Here it says, this is what Ahasuerus says to Esther and Mordecai. Now you write to the Jews as you see fit in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring for a decree which is written in the name of the king, and seal with the king's signet ring so that it may not be revoked. In verse 11, it tells us what was written. In them, the king granted the Jews who were in each and every city the right to assemble, to defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women, and to plunder their spoil. God uses Ahasuerus. He uses this weak man who wants to be in control, but ultimately is being controlled by everybody around him. He uses him to save his people. And not only to save his people, but to finally accomplish the command that Saul was given all the way back when he was told to destroy the Amalekites. And not only to do that, but to avenge himself on the enemies of his people who sought their destruction. And not only that, but to establish his people in Persia and to ensure their well-being. In Esther 9 in verse 4, it says, indeed, Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai became greater and greater. Thus the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. And so I want you to appreciate, even with a man who is as out of control as Ahasuerus is, God knows how to orchestrate all the events in this story to make sure he accomplishes his purpose and his glory. He uses his appetites against him. He uses the people around him to make sure